Al Capone wasn't just the king of Chicago's underworld, he was the king of the dinner table. Behind the Tommy guns and bootleg liquor, Capone lived for food. Spaghetti feasts in Little Italy, midnight steaks at hidden speakeasies, even humble bowls of soup he served to the poor. Every dish had a story of power, family, and survival in roaring 20s Chicago. And here's the twist, some of Capone's favorite meals are still around today. But back then, what cost a nickel might run you $20 now. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what the most feared gangster in America actually ate, and which of those meals you could still order tonight. 1. Spaghetti with walnut sauce. In the smoky backrooms of Chicago's Little Italy, Capone's men weren't always eating heavy steaks or expensive cuts of meat. Sometimes the boss ordered something simple but unforgettable: spaghetti with walnut sauce. This wasn't a fancy restaurant dish. It was a family recipe straight from southern Italy. Crushed walnuts blended with olive oil, garlic, and a dusting of cheese made a sauce that clung to every strand of pasta. Capone loved it because it tasted like home. His mother, Teresa, grew up on meals just like this, stretching ingredients so nothing went to waste. Around the table, soldiers shared stories, laughed, and swore loyalty, all over a plate of humble noodles. In that moment, food wasn't just fuel, it was a bond. Back then, this dish cost maybe 20 cents to make. Today, you'd pay closer to $12 in a trattoria. Proof that even gangsters knew sometimes the simplest meals carry the deepest power. 2. Italian pasta with tomato and meat sauce. If there was one dish that never failed to appear at Capone's table, it was pasta with tomato and meat sauce. This wasn't the watered-down spaghetti night we think of today. This was hearty, slow-simmered sauce bubbling for hours, packed with beef, pork, onions, and herbs, poured over thick pasta that could hold its weight. In Chicago's Little Italy, this dish wasn't just dinner. It was Sunday tradition. Families gathered after church, and Capone himself was no different. He often treated his men to plates piled high, a reminder that loyalty meant you'd never leave the table hungry. Stories say he even demanded meat sauce at private meetings, claiming no deal could be trusted without a proper meal first. Here's the wild part. In the 1920s, a big family pot of pasta and meat sauce might cost under $1 to feed 10 people. Today, a single plate in a restaurant could run you $18 to $20. Gangster luxury back then. Everyday comfort food now. 3. Minestrone soup. Not every meal at Capone's table was about excess. Sometimes the boss leaned into tradition, and nothing was more traditional than a steaming bowl of minestrone soup, packed with beans, carrots, onions, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were cheapest at the market. It was the kind of dish that stretched to feed an army. For Italian families in Chicago, it was the taste of survival and home. Capone reportedly loved this soup because it reminded him of his mother's kitchen. No two pots ever tasted the same. One day it might be cabbage-heavy, the next it leaned on potatoes. And for men who spent their nights guarding doors or cutting deals, a bowl of minestrone was a rare comfort. Best part? In the 1920s, a big pot cost barely 15 cents to make. Today, you'd shell out $10 for a bowl in a city restaurant. Humble then, trendy now, but for Capone, minestrone wasn't about money. It was about keeping his crew warm and loyal. 4. Rigatoni al forno. When Capone wanted something a little richer than soup, he went straight for rigatoni al forno, baked pasta layered with cheese, sauce, and just enough meat to make it hearty. Imagine a bubbling pan pulled from a hot oven, the edges crisped golden, mozzarella stretching as each portion was served. For Capone's crew, this was comfort disguised as celebration. In Chicago's Italian neighborhoods, rigatoni al forno was a Sunday centerpiece. It was the dish mothers made when company came over or when families needed to show abundance, even during lean years. For Capone, it wasn't just food, it was theater. Bringing a tray of baked pasta to the table sent a message: you were valued and you belonged. Back in the 1920s, the ingredients might have cost 40 to 50 cents for a big tray. Today, you'd pay $22 to $25 in a restaurant. In Capone's world, rigatoni al forno wasn't just dinner. It was proof that loyalty got you a seat at the feast. 5. Chicken Vesuvio. If there's one dish that screams Chicago Italian, it's chicken Vesuvio, and Capone was right in the middle of making it famous. Picture golden chicken roasted with garlic, white wine, olive oil, and potatoes, finished with a handful of peas. The dish got its name from Mount Vesuvius in Naples, but in Chicago's backrooms, it became a gangster favorite. Capone loved chicken Vesuvio because it felt both rustic and refined. It was hearty enough to feed hungry soldiers after a long night, but elegant enough to serve at smoke-filled meetings with city officials or rival bosses. Rumor has it that Capone insisted on sharing big platters of it, letting everyone eat family style, a not-so-subtle reminder that loyalty and business were always tied to the same table. In the 1920s, a whole chicken cost less than 30 cents, making Vesuvio a surprisingly cheap luxury. Today, order it in Chicago, and you're looking at $25 to $30 a plate. Proof that sometimes a gangster's taste lives on long after the guns went quiet. 6. Veal Scaloppine. Capone might have grown up on humble Italian staples, but when it came time to impress, Veal Scaloppine made its way to the table. Thin slices of veal, pounded tender, dredged lightly in flour, and sautéed in butter with a splash of white wine and lemon. This was old-world elegance brought to Chicago, the kind of dish that turned a backroom speakeasy into something that felt like a private club. Gangsters knew that business wasn't just sealed with handshakes, but with meals that showed class. Veal wasn't cheap, and serving it sent a clear message: you were dining with power. Capone liked that it was refined but quick to prepare, perfect for late-night meetings when time was short, but appearances mattered. In the 1920s, Veal Scaloppine might have run about $1 for a full dinner, pricey compared to pasta or soup. Today, order it at a high-end Italian restaurant, and you're dropping $35 to $45 a plate. For Capone, veal wasn't just food, it was status. 7. Baked lasagna. Few dishes carried the weight of tradition at Capone's table quite like baked lasagna. Picture it: thick sheets of pasta layered with ricotta, mozzarella, meat sauce, and parmesan bubbling hot from the oven. This wasn't just dinner, it was a centerpiece, a dish that demanded attention the moment it hit the table. For Capone, lasagna was more than food, it was heritage. His mother's generation made it to stretch ingredients across a big family, turning scraps of meat and leftover sauce into something unforgettable. When Capone hosted his men, lasagna sent a clear message: you're part of the family. Each slice wasn't just rich in flavor, but in meaning, loyalty baked right in. In the 1920s, you could assemble a big pan of lasagna for under 75 cents, feeding a dozen men until they were stuffed. Today, that same pan would cost over $30 in ingredients, and a single restaurant portion runs $18 to $22. For Capone, lasagna wasn't luxury. It was home, served gangster style. 8. Oxtail stew. When Capone's crew gathered in the colder months, one dish that often made an appearance was oxtail stew. This was the kind of meal that came straight from the peasant kitchens of Italy. Nothing fancy, just slow-cooked tails, simmered for hours with tomatoes, onions, carrots, and red wine until the meat fell off the bone. The broth turned rich and silky, the kind of flavor you couldn't rush. Capone liked oxtail stew because it was hearty, filling, and a reminder that even scrap cuts could become something extraordinary with patience. Around his table, it wasn't about how much money the meat cost. It was about the taste and the bond it created. His men would mop up every drop with crusty bread, joking, arguing, and plotting in equal measure. In the 1920s, oxtails were dirt cheap. Butchers practically gave them away. Today, they're a delicacy, selling for $8 to $10 per pound. What was once poor man's food is now high-end comfort, proving Capone's table had foresight even in its frugality. 9. Beef braciole. On nights when Capone wanted to show off true Italian flair, beef braciole was the star of the table. Imagine thin slices of beef rolled up with breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, and sometimes a sliver of cheese or prosciutto tucked inside, then simmered slowly in rich tomato sauce until tender. Each roll came out juicy and bursting with flavor, the sauce soaking into every bite of pasta served alongside. Braciole wasn't just food, it was performance. When the platter hit the table, men leaned in, forks ready, as the rolls were sliced to reveal their savory filling. For Capone, it symbolized abundance and hospitality. Hosting wasn't about subtlety, it was about making sure nobody left hungry, and braciole guaranteed that. In the 1920s, the cut of beef used for braciole was inexpensive, maybe 40 cents for enough to feed a family. Today, that same dish in a restaurant could run $28 to $35 a plate. What was once a humble family dish became a gangster banquet centerpiece. 10. Meatballs in tomato sauce with pasta. No table in Capone's Chicago was complete without the classic, meatballs in tomato sauce served over pasta. This was the dish that defined Italian-American cooking, hearty enough for gangsters who worked long nights, yet simple enough to feel like Sunday dinner at home. Big, tender meatballs simmered in a rich red sauce until every bite of pasta carried their flavor. Capone's crew loved it because it was a crowd pleaser. Nobody argued over meatballs. They just ate, laughed, and passed around bread to soak up the sauce. Some stories even say Capone insisted on meatballs at sit-downs because it was a food that slowed people down, forced them to eat together, and reminded everyone they were sharing more than just business. Back in the 1920s, ground beef was cheap, 15 cents a pound, and pasta cost pennies. A whole feast for 10 men might run less than $1. Today, the same meal would cost you closer to $40 to $50 at a restaurant. For Capone, meatballs weren't luxury. They were tradition, binding his empire together one plate at a time. 11. Osso buco. When Capone wanted to bring real old-world prestige to the table, osso buco made its entrance. Picture cross-cut veal shanks, braised low and slow with tomatoes, onions, carrots, and white wine until the meat practically melted off the bone. At the center of each shank sat the prized marrow, rich, buttery, and scooped out with a spoon like liquid gold. This dish wasn't just food, it was ceremony. In Naples and Milan, osso buco was a Sunday luxury, and Capone carried that tradition into Chicago. Sharing marrow bones was a mark of respect, and offering the centerpiece to a guest was a gesture of trust. For Capone, it wasn't just about feeding his men, it was about showing them the elegance of his heritage. In the 1920s, veal shanks were affordable, maybe 50 cents a pound, making osso buco a surprisingly practical feast. Today, it's a high-end restaurant dish, costing $40 to $60 a plate. What Capone called dinner, we now call fine dining. 12. Polenta with sausage and gravy. Not every gangster meal had to be glamorous. Sometimes Capone's table leaned on the kind of rustic dish his parents grew up eating in southern Italy, polenta with sausage and gravy. Imagine a big wooden bowl of creamy cornmeal, steaming hot, topped with rich tomato gravy and sizzling Italian sausages. It was simple, hearty, and built to feed a crowd. For immigrant families in Chicago, polenta was survival food. Cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile, it stretched a few sausages far enough to satisfy 10 hungry men. Capone reportedly loved these kinds of dishes because they reminded his men of home. Around the table, there was no boss and no soldier, just Italians eating the food their mothers used to make. That kind of memory built loyalty more than any speech ever could. In the 1920s, cornmeal cost only a few pennies a pound, and sausages were about 20 cents a link. Today, that same humble dish would cost $18 to $22 in a restaurant. Proof that even gangsters knew the value of peasant food turned feast. 13. Braised lamb shanks. When Capone wanted something hearty enough to silence a room, braised lamb shanks did the trick. The shanks were seared until golden, then simmered low and slow with garlic, rosemary, red wine, and tomatoes until the meat slid clean off the bone. The aroma filled the backroom, rich and earthy, clinging to the air long after the plates were cleared. For Italian immigrants, lamb was a holiday meat, tied to Easter or big family gatherings. Capone, serving it to his men, wasn't just about feeding them. It was a statement. You're family, you're valued, you're here to stay. In a world where loyalty meant survival, a tender lamb shank carried more weight than a pile of cash. In the 1920s, lamb was affordable, maybe 25 cents a pound at Chicago markets. Today, braised lamb shanks are a restaurant luxury, often $35 to $45 per plate. What once fed poor Southern Italian families became a gangster's way of showing power through generosity. 14. Pan-seared fish. Capone's crew didn't always eat heavy meats and pastas. Sometimes the table turned to something lighter, like pan-seared fish. Fresh catch from Lake Michigan or shipments from the East Coast would be simply seasoned with salt, pepper, olive oil, and maybe a squeeze of lemon, then seared golden in a hot pan. The result? Crispy edges, tender flesh, and a dish that felt both refined and refreshing after nights of red wine and rich sauces. For Italians, fish wasn't just food, it carried tradition. Fridays often meant meatless meals, and Capone, despite his violent reputation, still kept to cultural habits passed down from his Catholic upbringing. Fish dinners became an anchor of normalcy, a reminder that even gangsters observed rituals from home. In the 1920s, local perch or whitefish from Chicago's markets cost only a few cents a pound. Today, order a simple pan-seared fish at a restaurant and you'll likely pay $25 to $30. Capone's table proved that even simplicity had its place in a gangster's feast. 15. Clams and linguine. When Capone wanted to impress with something that spoke straight from the Italian coastline, clams and linguine made an appearance. Picture tender clams, simmered in garlic, olive oil, and white wine, their briny juice soaking into a bed of pasta. The aroma was pure ocean meeting Little Italy, light, fragrant, but still filling enough for a hungry crew. Seafood wasn't everyday fare in Chicago, but Capone had the connections to get it shipped in fresh. Serving clams wasn't just about taste, it was about showing reach and wealth. Around the table, gangsters twirled their linguine, cracking jokes, while the boss reminded them that business could be as smooth as a seafood dinner or as rough as the streets outside. In the 1920s, a pound of clams might cost 15 to 20 cents, making this dish surprisingly affordable for those who could get the supply. Today, clams and linguine is a restaurant classic running $28 to $35 a plate. For Capone, it was more than dinner. It was a power move in a bowl. 16. Eggplant Parmigiana. Not every plate at Capone's table needed meat to feel like a feast. Eggplant Parmigiana was a favorite straight out of southern Italy. Slices of eggplant breaded, fried golden, layered with tomato sauce and mozzarella, then baked until bubbling. It came to the table hot and fragrant, with cheese stretching as forks dug in. For immigrant families, this dish was a clever way to stretch budgets. Eggplant was cheap, plentiful, and when prepared right, it gave the satisfaction of a meat dish without the cost. Capone liked it because it carried the taste of Naples, a comfort food that reminded his men of their mothers' kitchens. It was humble but hearty, proving you didn't need steak to win respect around the table. In the 1920s, an eggplant cost just a nickel, and the whole dish could be made for under 30 cents. Today, order eggplant parmigiana in Chicago, and you'll pay $18 to $22. What once fed poor families became a gangster's way of bringing home to the big city. 17. Zuppa di fagioli. On colder Chicago nights, Capone's men often found steaming bowls of zuppa di fagioli, Italian bean soup, waiting on the table. This wasn't glamorous food, but it was soul-warming. Cannellini beans simmered with garlic, onions, tomatoes, and a drizzle of olive oil turned into a thick, hearty stew that could fill stomachs and stretch across dozens of bowls. For Italian immigrants, bean soup was survival. It cost pennies, but delivered comfort that reminded them of village kitchens back in the old country. Capone reportedly loved it because it symbolized his roots, a reminder that even though he was the richest and most feared man in Chicago, he came from a family that knew the value of making a little go a long way. In the 1920s, a whole pot of zuppa di fagioli could be made for less than 15 cents, enough to feed a crew of hungry gangsters. Today, order a bowl in an Italian trattoria and you'll likely pay $10 to $12. For Capone, this simple bean soup wasn't just cheap food. It was loyalty in a bowl. 18. Caponata. When Capone wanted something tangy and bold to cut through all the heavy pastas and meats, caponata hit the table. This Sicilian favorite was a sweet and sour mix of eggplant, tomatoes, celery, onions, capers, and olives, all stewed down in olive oil and vinegar. Served at room temperature with bread, it was both appetizer and side dish, packing a punch of flavor in every bite. Caponata carried more than taste, it carried culture. In Sicily, it was a dish of balance, bitter and sweet, rich and sharp, a reflection of survival and resilience. For Capone, serving caponata wasn't about luxury, it was about memory. It reminded his men that no matter how powerful they'd become in Chicago, their roots were in humble kitchens where nothing was wasted. Back in the 1920s, you could make a generous bowl of caponata for about 20 cents, using cheap market vegetables. Today, order it in a restaurant as an appetizer and you'll pay $12 to $15. For Capone, this wasn't filler food. It was a taste of Sicily, right in the heart of Chicago. 19. Arancini. When Capone wanted to add a little fun to the spread, arancini were the perfect bite. These golden rice balls, stuffed with cheese, peas, or bits of meat, were rolled in breadcrumbs and fried until crispy on the outside and molten inside. Served hot, they were the kind of finger food that disappeared fast once the platter hit the table. For Sicilian immigrants, arancini were more than snacks. They were a way to stretch leftovers into something exciting. Yesterday's risotto turned into today's feast, proving that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Capone loved them for another reason. They were perfect for parties. Whether he was hosting politicians, gangsters, or just his closest men, arancini brought laughter and comfort, reminding everyone of home. In the 1920s, a batch of arancini might cost 10 to 15 cents to make, since rice and breadcrumbs were cheap staples. Today, order them as an appetizer in Chicago, and you'll pay $10 to $14 for just a few pieces. What was once peasant street food became a gangster's party favorite. 20. Tiramisu or Zabaglione. Even gangsters had a sweet tooth, and Capone's table sometimes ended with Italian classics like tiramisu or Zabaglione. Imagine layers of espresso-soaked ladyfingers, mascarpone cream, and cocoa dusted on top. Tiramisu was indulgence in a pan. Or picture Zabaglione, a frothy custard whipped with egg yolks, sugar, and Marsala wine, served warm in glasses. Both desserts carried a sense of elegance, a way to end a meal with flair. For immigrant families, sweets weren't everyday food. They were reserved for holidays or special guests. Capone, serving them at gatherings, showed that his meals weren't just about feeding, they were about impressing. These desserts made a statement. This wasn't some back-alley operation. This was dining fit for kings. In the 1920s, Zabaglione could be made cheaply at home for under 20 cents, while tiramisu, a bit fancier, might have cost 40 cents for a tray. Today, tiramisu runs $8 to $10 a slice, and Zabaglione is rare outside fine restaurants. For Capone, dessert was proof that even power needed a sweet finish. 21. Sweet rolls, brioche. Mornings in Capone's world didn't always start with chaos. Sometimes they began with something simple, like sweet rolls or brioches. Fresh from Italian bakeries in Chicago's Little Italy, these golden pastries were soft, buttery, and slightly sweet. often served with strong coffee. For a man who lived by the night, a quiet breakfast like this was a rare moment of normalcy. Brioches weren't just treats, they were a taste of Europe. Immigrants lined up at neighborhood bakeries for them, and Capone, despite his reputation, wasn't above joining in. He reportedly had boxes of sweet rolls delivered to meetings, a way to break the ice before business turned serious. Sharing bread built trust, and for Capone, trust was everything. In the 1920s, a sweet roll cost only a penny or two, making them accessible to working families. Today, a single brioche roll might run $3 to $4 in a cafe. What was once the cheapest comfort became an upscale indulgence, proof that Capone's table knew how to balance power with sweetness. 22. Bread and olive oil, or olive tapenade. Before the heavy dishes arrived, Capone's tables often started with the simplest of all Italian traditions: fresh bread with olive oil, or sometimes a rustic olive tapenade. Picture a crusty loaf torn apart by hand, dipped into golden oil, or spread with a briny mix of olives, garlic, and herbs. It wasn't fancy, but it set the tone. This was a meal meant to be shared. For immigrant families, bread was sacred. It was cheap, filling, and always present at the table. Capone never forgot that. Even in his world of wealth and power, breaking bread carried meaning. It softened conversations, calmed tempers, and reminded everyone they were bound by more than just business. In fact, some say Capone would stall meetings until bread was served, because nothing serious should start on an empty stomach. In the 1920s, a loaf of bread cost about 5 cents. Today, artisanal bread with oil or tapenade at a restaurant might run $8 to $12. For Capone, it wasn't about cost. It was about connection, the simplest food holding the most power. 23. Soup and bread. Capone may have been feared on the streets, but in 1930, during the early days of the Great Depression, he shocked Chicago with a different kind of move, opening a soup kitchen. Hungry men, women, and children lined up for hot soup, hunks of bread, and black coffee, all served free of charge under the banner of Big Al. The soup itself was nothing fancy, often a thin vegetable broth with potatoes, beans, or pasta scraps, paired with bread from local bakeries. But for the thousands who showed up, it meant survival. Capone wasn't just feeding stomachs, he was feeding an image. Some say he did it to soften his public reputation, others believe he genuinely remembered the hardship of immigrant families scraping by. Either way, soup and bread became part of his story. In 1929 to 1930, that meal cost only a few pennies per serving. Today, a similar bowl with bread in Chicago might run $8 to $10. For the city's poor, Capone's soup kitchen wasn't about gangsters or guns, it was about hope in a bowl. 24. Roast pork with herbs. When Capone wanted to host a true feast, roast pork with herbs often stole the spotlight. Picture a whole pork roast rubbed with garlic, rosemary, fennel seeds, and olive oil, then slow roasted until the skin turned crisp and the meat inside stayed juicy. Platters of thick slices were brought out, dripping with pan juices, filling the room with an aroma that made even the toughest mobster smile. Pork was a staple in Italian kitchens, tied to celebrations and family gatherings. For Capone, serving it meant abundance. No one at his table would leave hungry. It was also symbolic. Pork was affordable but versatile, proof that simple ingredients, handled right, could rival any luxury. At business dinners, this dish was more than food. It was a signal of generosity and control, showing Capone's reach stretched from street corners to banquet halls. In the 1920s, a pork roast might cost 25 to 30 cents a pound. Today, a similar roast dinner in a restaurant could run $28 to $35 per plate. What was once working man's food became a gangster's way of saying, "You're eating well because you're with me." 25. Prosciutto and cheese platter. Every feast needs a beginning, or an ending, that lingers in memory. For Capone, that often meant a prosciutto and cheese platter, Thin slices of salty, cured ham laid beside hunks of sharp provolone, maybe a wedge of pecorino, and a basket of crusty bread. Simple, rustic, yet undeniably rich. It was the kind of spread that reminded his men of the old country while showing off the best imports money could buy. Prosciutto wasn't everyday food in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods. It was special. Bringing it out meant celebration, respect, and status. Capone knew that laying a platter like this on the table spoke louder than words. It said, "We've made it. We're not scraping by anymore." Sharing it wasn't just about taste, it was about pride and power. In the 1920s, imported prosciutto and aged cheeses might have cost a few dollars, a fortune compared to pasta and beans. Today, a prosciutto platter in a Chicago restaurant runs $18 to $25. Back then, it was a gangster's indulgence. Now, it's a timeless symbol of Italian hospitality. Al Capone's story is usually told through bullets, booze, and backroom deals. But when you look closer, the meals he ate paint a different picture. Spaghetti with walnut sauce, hearty minestrone, osso buco, even humble bread with olive oil. These weren't just dishes. They were memories from the old country, tokens of loyalty and signals of power. Around his table, enemies became allies, business became personal, and food became a weapon just as sharp as any knife. And here's the thing, nearly a century later, you can still taste that history in Chicago. Walk into an old-school Italian joint, and you might just order the same pasta, soup, or roast that once sat in front of public enemy number one. The prices have changed, sure, but the flavors? They're eternal. Capone may have ruled with fear, but he fed with familiarity. In the end, his empire wasn't just built on crime. It was built over dinner tables filled with food that told his story.